After jointly declaring war on Germany in September 1939, and with France capitulating in June 1940, Great Britain stood alone in its quest to subdue Nazi Germany and prevent its emerging continental empire from eclipsing Britain's global one. Winston Churchill, in particular, proved decisive in refusing peace offers from Adolf Hitler, and despite protests from his cabinet, gambled the British Empire on maintaining their vital military and supply lines with the United States while under aerial bombardment during the Blitz and losing millions of tons of shipping to the Kriegsmarine. The World at War series highlights the losses the British suffered from German bombers, but by the end of the war, the Royal Air Force managed to incinerate over 480,000 German citizens in nighttime raids, approximately 10 times the amount the Luftwaffe killed over the British Isles. Tonight we are again joined by Thomas777 to interpret the strategies and tactics employed during the Battle of Britain and how it was a mere prelude to the coming struggle in the East.
The Atlantic, Britain's lifeline. Treacherous enough in peacetime, in war, black with menace. U-boat packs stalk through the night, knowing the danger. Their victims still plow on.
Auf, fertig, frei.
Ships and cargoes go down. Their crews, some of them, survive. But early in 1943, it is Britain's survival and the Allied hopes for victory over Germany which are in doubt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. We are rejoining the regularly scheduled programming for the World at War series. This is going to be our third episode covering the Battle of Britain. We have touched upon before the war, focusing on the German perspective prior to 1939. And our second episode was focused on the Battle of France and the Western Front in general, where the French, English, and Germans were fighting. And once France capitulated, and this is coming from Churchill, this became colloquially called the Battle of Britain. So effectively, we're going from 1940 through 1945. And the World at War series does a reasonable job breaking down some of the perspectives, but they spread it out over the 26 episodes they released. So officially, we're going to be covering episodes 4, 10, and 15, if I have that right. But effectively, it is the air war, the Battle of the Atlantic, and then the home front from the British perspective. And so with that, I would like to start with the air war stuff, but if you guys have anything you wanted to just add in as commentary before we dive into the details, please go for it.
No, man, I'm fine on my end. Take us away.
All right. And Thomas, recently I actually picked up a copy of the David Irving book. I think it was Inside the Luftwaffe. It was the Milch book.
Yeah, Rise and Fall of the Luftwaffe.
That was very, very helpful in understanding what was going on in the minds of the Germans in particular. And then the documentary does a good job of what was going on from the British perspective when it came to the Royal Air Force. But the air war, as it were, between the British and the Germans was extremely important in 1940 in particular. After that, 1941 onwards, it started tailing off for various reasons. And the long and short of it is that the Germans reallocated their efforts towards Russia. But in 1940, that was truly the height of the dog fighting, the bombing of the British Isles from the Germans, and that's when the Royal Air Force really was able to hold them off and saw the most combat over the British Isles. And they did that effectively through a combination of just having a home field advantage, frankly, and then the Germans, conversely, having the disadvantage of having a longer range to reach the British Isles from the mainland of Europe, and having a difficult fuel limitation by only allowing them about 10 or 20 minutes over the British Isles before they had to turn around if they wanted to save their aircraft. And so the British had an enormous advantage just from that. But additionally, they were able to very intelligently, and I'll give them credit for this, implement the use of radar to give them a very clear picture of where the Germans were coming in to attempt their bombing raids. And by doing the combination of just keeping the forces clustered on the British Isles, which actually was a decision that one of their generals actually had to make. In other words, he didn't dispatch as many aircraft to the Battle of France. He kept them in reserve for the British. They had a lot of aircraft ready to go, and their production numbers were actually fairly good. They doubled their production, I think, in 1940, and they were able to keep pace with whatever the Germans were putting into play. And they utilized the system, a centralized command and control system fed in by all the radar networks and all actual spotters that were positioned behind the coastal radar arrays, where they would actually synthesize all that information to effectively create what today we kind of take for granted. But if anybody's played like a real-time strategy game, they can see like the whole map of what's going on at once. They had that, and they had that in one central location. That gave them a clear picture of where to allocate their fighter aircraft to intercept the bombers and whatever escort fighter aircraft the Germans were sending. And so doing that effectively gave them, I think, a higher kill ratio than the Germans. It wasn't too lopsided, but they were able to hold them off, and that was through radar and just having a home field advantage. I think those are the two main takeaways I had.
Yeah, no, that was key. And early on, the Royal Air Force, particularly the Air Ministry, it was larded with talent, including Bomber Harris, who was essential in the kind of praxis of strategic bombing. And as I think we came back to, I want to come back to what I think we touched on briefly earlier, just speaking in policy terms of, what the German Reich's disposition was towards the UK once it became clear that the war party was not going to negotiate. Germany had no strategic bombing capability at all. It was a combined arms ground attack force with a strong tactical capability. The Luftwaffe had incredible fighter aces, but this idea that obviously the political context is completely made hash with the fact that the Germans made literally half a dozen peace overtures to the UK, which were rebuffed outright. But not only did the Fuhrer forbid the bombing of civilian targets, but there really was no capability to force a capitulation by strategic bombing. So there is something preposterous when these kind of old Tory types act as if they were availed to this terror campaign of strategic bombing without cause. You had a bunch of 2-engine fighters, essentially trying to, trying to deposit what amounts to comparatively light ordnance on military targets in a precision capacity. And I mean, this was a fool's errand because there just wasn't there wasn't the technology to do that at scale as necessary. But there wasn't even the capability to quote terror bomb the United Kingdom. That's a fundamental aspect of this subject matter.
So the number that the Germans were able to kill in Britain in 1940, as far as I could tell, was about 40,000 at most. And that starts tapering off, as I said, quite quickly. And I may even have that as an overestimate because of I did a deep dive on a lot of this data, and it's been quite overwhelming, actually. But what happened was,
for comparison, in one day, Operation Gomorrah, the bombing of Hamburg, 50,000 people were annihilated.
Yeah. So I was going to make that point, and I appreciate you having some context, because that's really what ultimately happened. Is the Germans, they made an effort in 1940 to try to effectively, as you pointed out, get the British to come to terms on an armistice, and they dropped the vast majority of their bombs in 1940. After that, they effectively cut it by 75-80%, almost to nothing. And the British, conversely, who were not actually attacking Germany until 1941 in any real meaningful way, quadrupled and then doubled again, the amount of kills they were making with their bombs. And there's in that book that Irving wrote after interviewing Milch, there were many cases where the British were actively targeting civilian areas around industrial targets, but avoiding the industrial targets, in effect trying to kill the workforce and not the actual assets, which is quite ridiculous in terms of the engagement rules for most civilized nations when it comes to war. And so it effectively, whatever Germany did in 1940 was probably 10x'd by the British over the next four years.
Well, also
in terms of people killed.
Too, just real quick, Churchill bombed Berlin half a dozen times and was beside himself because the Germans wouldn't retaliate. And then finally, when Goering put it to Hitler, you've got to retaliate, against London, against civilian targets. Otherwise, we're going to have a real problem as regards not just your mandate with the German people, but with the OKW, which at that point still had a lot of independent clout. This is essential. Churchill basically was desperate to provoke an assault on London's civilian population to preserve this war mandate that was totally evaporating in the wake of, what amounted to a defeat at Dunkirk. That's completely fucking insane. That'd be like a U.S. president. That'd be like if George W. Bush was trying to cultivate 9/11 and was beside himself when he couldn't get it to happen, and people then held him out as some great hero for facilitating this.
Yeah, and all these accusations, these British accusations of German terror bombing of civilians, as you said, they're nothing but complete projection.
Very much so. Very much so.
And we'll get into
an opportunity. Actually, we should, especially in the context of German peace overtures, we should probably just talk about Dunkirk now and some of the mythology around it.
Yeah, and that's essential. Yeah, I'll let you guys take it away in a moment. And again, forgive my voice; I'm still kind of fighting off illness. But the UK lost the war on the beach of Dunkirk. It was done. The perspective of Berlin and the foreign ministry was, okay, how do we come to terms? We don't have any demands other than cessation of hostilities. London simply insisting we're just going to endlessly perpetuate a state of hostilities that was patently irrational. Towards what end? It didn't make any sense.
There's and please focus on Dunkirk, Nick. But let me just make a couple comments real quick. There's a British movie called The Darkest Hour. I think it came out in 2017, and I didn't really want to watch it, but I just sat through it because I felt it would inform the discussion tonight. And effectively, it's about Churchill. It's about what he was sort of dealing with prior to effectively taking over as prime minister and leading Britain into a embittered battle with Germany. And what it shows is kind of the British Parliament and the cabinet and what the discussions were going on behind the scenes with him and with the king. And quite frankly, Churchill stood alone in the desire to continue the war. He really was wanting to do this against most of the people, including the king and a lot of the people who were in the government attempting to meet through envoys from Italy, actually, to try to negotiate terms. And it was just Churchill's sort of whim. And he actually broke his word several times that he was going to agree to actually at least flesh out a possible discussion and meet privately with the Italians as intermediaries to see what the Germans might want. And he just broke that promise that he was going to do that. And then he just made a speech at the parliament. And this is how the movie portrays it. I don't know exactly how accurate it is, but effectively you could view him as sort of responsible for carrying on the war. And I wanted to get into also why that war was so ridiculous for Britain, but we'll do that in the Battle of the Atlantic in particular. Last thing I'll say is, and again, I don't have a source on where this came from, but it's attributed to Adolf Hitler. This is a quote he made about the British. "The blood of every single Englishman is too valuable to be shed. Our two people belong together racially and traditionally. This has always been my aim, even if our generals can't grasp it." And this was a post made on Twitter in response to the fact that Churchill rejected over a dozen peace deals made by Hitler. And he also initiated the bombing of cities. He bombed Germany for months without any retaliation, as Hitler was hoping Churchill would come to his senses. So,
yeah, and just as an aside, and I think this is important. It's not just a matter of intriguing trivia. Italy being an Il Duce kind of being insinuated as a potential intermediary. We talked about, I think, the Four Powers Pact last session. And really up until 1941, the Kingdom of Italy was viewed, and Il Duce himself, they were viewed not just as an important, as an important potential brokering element, within kind of the thicket of European diplomacy, but Duce was very respected as kind of a learned statesman who was responsible not just for an Italian miracle, as it were, in terms of the reconstitution of the kingdom and its fortunes, but also as a man with a progressive view of collective security in Europe. He's kind of cast now as this like buffoon or this maniac, and that's completely at odds with perception in situ as it was.
Yeah, I mean, so in the case of Dunkirk, it's not very complicated. The fact is the German army could have slaughtered the British, and it was Hitler himself who intervened and gave the order to hold back the advance.
Yeah, 100%. And that was completely congruous with Westphalian Convention, which in the West was always abided really until 1944. And the situation became critical. For the Axis, but yeah, people act like this is this anomalous, inexplicable thing. It's like, well, I mean, what else would the disposition have been of the Fuhrer and OKW? I mean, first of all, there wasn't some terrible enmity between the UK and Germany. it was absolutely contrived. And secondly, for what it held for 3 centuries was this kind of moral consensus that Europeans afford each other certain dignities and certain immunities and, certain privileges whereby there's, limitations on what measures will be undertaken at war, between European states. And the UK's deliberate breach with this, waging a genocidal war against their own kind on the continent, that was unthinkable to anybody else.
Yeah, and being an American and not really having this be something that I grew up with, I don't actually know. I mean, the documentary doesn't really focus that much on it, but how was this explained? Do you guys know how this was supposed to be explained to the British people or the British Army, your average soldier?
I mean, I don't think it was any surprise to your average Tommy that, German Panthers didn't close up their position on the beach and start machine gunning them mercilessly. I think the average man in the street, to Nick's point, that didn't have any enmity towards the Germans or view them as this kind of bestial element that was, ominously targeting them for destruction. I think the way the British media censors tried to present it was that Hitler and Goering were a couple of buffoons who overestimated the tactical efficacy of ground assault aircraft, and they totally botched this operation. So thank God, owing to the gumption and elan of our Tommies, they got away. I mean, typical nonsense of that sort.
And there was a film made recently. It was a Christopher Nolan made a film, a Dunkirk film, which I did.
It's a bizarre movie, yeah.
It's a very bizarre movie. And the only reason the movie works at all from a narrative and dramatic perspective is that it doesn't show any German perspective at all. And so, it just puts you in the position of soldiers who themselves don't even really know what's going on through their own chain of command. And the Germans are sort of presented as like a force outside of humanity, which is not uncommon.
Well, it wasn't clear either. I mean, to be clear, the Allied Expeditionary Force, it had it made no, aside from the politics being deranged, leading up to the decision to deploy, it's not clear what the Expeditionary Force was supposed to be doing. It's obviously they were totally incapable of deploying to the battle space in September 39. Then there was the Sitzkrieg. So there was this kind of make-believe situation of hostilities that endured for months, that the Germans kind of ironically referred to as the Sitzkrieg, the phony war. And then finally, the Wehrmacht essentially routed them. But, especially for the British, who, to their credit, are generally known for tactical flourish and for deep planning, from inception, the entire deployment was a tactical nullity.
Nick, did you have more on Dunkirk?
No, I think that about covers it. It was when I first read about it, I was kind of blew my mind many years ago that this happened, that they were absolutely defeated, and that they were allowed honorably to live, and they were repaid with the terror bombing of their civilian capitals.
Well, I'll also make the point too, because this undoubtedly, and the rebuttal of most court historians, they're going to claim that, the UK was in mortal jeopardy really until the early months in 1942, or at least until summer of 41, owing to the, Operation Sea Lion and its planned implementation. Sea Lion was a strategic ruse from inception. For those who don't know, Sea Lion was the code name of the alleged planned amphibious assault of the United Kingdom by the Wehrmacht. And Hitler made a show of repurposing barges with aircraft engines, which probably would not even have worked. But the point is, this, and the point of strategic ruse, to be clear, wasn't to intimidate London or the British body politic. It was directed to lure Stalin into a false sense of security that, you know, Germany was none the wiser about Stalin's plan to assault West. You know, so Sea Lion was never realistic, or nor was it intended to be, you know, an operational paradigm that was going to be realized. And obviously, too, aside from the fact there wasn't the forces in being in terms of the, you know, landing craft to deposit, you know, 150,000 Lancers on a beachhead in the United Kingdom. But even had there been, you know, defeating the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy to implement Sea Lion was an essential precondition, and obviously that wasn't in the cards. But because this might seem superficially tangential, but I can't emphasize enough, Germany's only path to Endsieg in World War II is the defeat of the Soviet Union. There is no other path to final victory. Germany wins by defeating the USSR. So this idea that, well, Hitler was being scattershot and he just assaulted East because, you know, he had nowhere else to move, and, you know, there was a kind of analysis paralysis and lack of strategic options, you know, in the wake of Sea Lion's operational, you know, shortcomings, potentially. That's the wrong way to look at it. And, you know, I've made the point again and again, anybody who claims it was a, quote, error to assault the Soviet Union, they don't have any understanding of the strategic landscape, of the causes of the war, of, you know, the conditions precedent to hostilities, or, you know, the conditions that would facilitate German victory. The only path to victory was defeat of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union goes down. Fortress Europe becomes a reality. Germany becomes a superpower. The UK has no choice but to accept the new strategic reality. You know, game, set, match.
There are many ways to look at this. I shared in the Telegram, actually, some charts that I prepared for this and future episodes that I think it bears relevance to. And to compress all this into one particular strategic decision to invade Russia is difficult. But if you look at all those charts, the common theme is that the resource disadvantage the Germans were experiencing and up against when the United States in particular started entering the war in full force was stark. And if they did not do something about that, they were going to lose no matter what. And many Germans have said this too. Like Blitzkrieg was sort of the same concept. It was they employed that because they didn't have the amount of equipment that their opponents had, and so they had to use it all at once in this quote Schwerpunkt strategy of focusing everything to try to destroy their enemies as quickly as possible. Because if they waited, they would get overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of the whole thing. So I don't know if you guys have that open, but I'll basically give a quick overview. I think petroleum is the most damning statistic that I could find. You can look at food, aluminum. I've done all that stuff as well, but petroleum in particular should scare anyone if they're not the United States, because the United States was the not superpower. They were the hyper power on the planet in terms of making oil, and we're talking more than, you know, the USSR, which has a lot of natural resources, more than anyone. And this is what the Japanese ran into when they got cut off and why they ended up invading Southeast Asia. But The British had no oil what to speak of. And so all of the convoys that were being sent over to the British, in addition to all the food and the weapons and material, it was oil. And so the British, out of the 100 or so units that they needed per year, they only had the ability to procure one of those units themselves. And the Germans also were at a disadvantage, but not even as bad as the British. The problem the Germans had, though, was they didn't have the backing of the United States. And they also had, even with their synthetic fuel production, even with their fields in Romania, who was an ally, and then whatever they captured in the Ukraine and whatnot, they were looking at a 20-to-1 disadvantage in terms of production of petroleum, which is essential to fighting a modern war. We're talking aircraft kerosene for jet fuel or for piston aircraft at the time, and then eventually they did jets. But basically, jet fuel or aircraft fuel, tanks consume a huge amount of diesel, and then also military transports. The light trucks need fuel, and so one of the reasons the Germans employed over 1 million horses is they didn't have any fuel, and if they could somehow obtain that in Russia, and partly why Stalingrad became such a mess was they felt that they could achieve that by taking that part of the Soviet Union and obtaining the nearby oil fields. But to your point, Thomas, and I've come to this sort of realization a little bit more recently than I have in the past, but the statistics really help me understand this, because Germany would have absolutely lost if they didn't get some sort of resource advantage, because the United States was backing the British, and the British would have died like without the United States, no question about it. And I don't know if it's time to talk about the Battle of the Atlantic, but that was effectively how they survived as long as they did.
No, we'll segue into the Battle of the Atlantic just in just a second. You know, to be clear, I can't remember if I raised this last session or not. You know, I'm a huge fan of Brendan Sims. He's written a great political biography of Adolf Hitler. You know, it's just phenomenal. And he makes the point in there, Hitler estimated in 1938, and he was correct. You know, Hitler was something of a savant when it came to data and, you know, and statistical inputs, particularly that had, you know, military significance at scale. You know, America as of 1938 possessed right about 50% of this planet's remaining natural resources. You know, the power potential was just unfathomable. You know, and then Hitler, like every man who had a deep understanding of, you know, the evolving political and geostrategic situation, understood that the superpower era was upon us. You know, Europe would become a superpower or die. And the only way to understand kind of Hitler's obsessive mission, the only way to understand the National Socialist cause, the only way to understand every move that was made from 1933 onward is to understand that single ambition to make Germany a superpower. And the only path to that is through Moscow. And of course, there's, you know, the epochal and ideological struggle with communism. And there's also, you know, the existential menace posed by, you know, Stalin. But all these, the only way to understand Germany's situation is what you just said. And the only way to understand victory conditions are to understand, you know, that the defeat of the Soviet Union is the exclusive path to those conditions. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, so the other part of the Battle of Britain, given the British Isles are islands, has to include the waterways. And this is where the battle gets, I think, very, very fascinating, because the force structures between the Germans and the Allies was very, very, very different. And the strategies were effectively opposite as well. The German strategy was effectively attack and on the water specifically, and the Allied strategy was defend, and then the force structure was completely different. The whole battle of the Atlantic revolved around the fact that the British needed resupply constantly from not only their empire but also the United States and Canada. And without those supplies, they would, and the documentary basically says, like, they would have crumbled within 3 months because their domestic ability to keep up with petroleum being most obvious, given that they had absolutely no domestic sources, the North Sea had not been discovered yet. They had to import that from the Caribbean and other areas. And their food supply was also insufficient to support their domestic needs, as well as some of their aluminum. And so without those convoys, they would have crumbled. And so what the Kriegsmarine under eventually
Donitz, but initially Raider, yeah.
Right. Was focused on sinking as many of those Liberty ships later from the United States after they joined the war. But prior to that, it was just British shipping and Canadians and whatnot. They were focused on sinking those things. And the way they did that was through a combination of various strategies, but it was primarily through the submarine, the U-boat. And I'm not as familiar with Raider because he wasn't as around for very long. But when Donitz got in there, he basically employed the Wolfpack strategy, which is using a group. Again, it's more of like this blitzkrieg attempt, but grouping your forces into these formations and going after groups of the British ships. And they would often do it at night when it was difficult to spot them, because they would usually have to come actually to the surface and just have their con tower sticking out. And then they would be able to identify the British, and they would shoot torpedoes at them. And they were extremely successful in the first couple of years until the Allies figured out ways to obstruct their efforts. But if you look at the gross tonnage lost, I'll share this in the Telegram. I don't know if you guys can see this, but let me just read it real quick. In 1940, in the Eastern Atlantic, which is effectively they call it the Western approaches to the British, where they were getting a lot of their shipments, they lost the most tonnage. It was like let me measure this out real quick. It was over a million tons that they lost, and the other areas were less consequential. As the war progressed, and actually when the Americans entered the war, the Kriegsmarine shifted their focus towards the Western Atlantic, towards the Americans, who actually were absolutely unprepared for what the U-boats were bringing. And they sank 2 million tons in the Western Atlantic. That includes the Caribbean, but also off the eastern seaboard, where at the beginning of the war, for the United States at least, the cities of New York, Boston, I think there was Portland, Maine, and there was one more, I think maybe Norfolk, Virginia, were the primary targets for the Germans. The Americans were so, you could say, overconfident effectively, but they just really didn't know that you needed to turn your lights out at night, because they created these huge background silhouettes for the ships that were trying to get through these submarine nets. And because you can imagine Manhattan being lit up all night, which they didn't want to not do because the businesses were complaining about losing business. So they kept the lights on for a few months. So the Germans just had a field day. They could see all the boats that were moving across, the water because of those lights, and they sank 2 million tons in 1942. But I think it was 1942 or 43. It was May. I want to say 43. That was the turning point.
Yes, it was 43 was the tipping point.
Yeah. And
to be clear, just real quick. It was Donitz was a great man in all kinds of ways, and he warrants a discussion unto himself later. He was he was the last Reichspräsident, but I mean that affords him a significance unto itself. But he understood that submarine warfare is the future, and he understood that trying to challenge the British or the American surface fleets was a fool's errand, and that's one of the reasons why Rader got sacked in favor of Donitz. But no, go ahead, buddy.
Well, what happened was the Germans had a couple of advantages. Obviously, using submarines gives you a certain level of stealth that the British and Americans were having a hard time combating. But over the course of the war, the Allies were able to develop a series of convoy strategies where they would group their ships into these kind of like triangle formations that were able to turn very quickly, and they also used aircraft and radar, and then a combination of some primitive sonar to finally figure out where these submarines were. And they also broke several German codes, which the Germans had also broken from the Allies' perspective. So both sides were like reading each other's like secret messages and finding out where the forces were. But by 43, it became kind of to the Allies' advantage, where they were able to discern all this stuff, and all those factors put together gave them kind of a tipping point where they were able to reduce the amount of ships that were lost by quite a bit. I mean, it went down. It peaked 42, and then dropped off by 50%, and then another 50% in the subsequent years. And it was through actually also using a long range, I want to say it was the B-24 Liberator, but it was able to get into the Mid-Atlantic Gap, which was an area of the North Atlantic where between Iceland and Britain, there was a range that the airplanes couldn't get to. And in that area, that's where Dönitz was sending most of his mid-Atlantic fleet to attack those convoys that were going through those waterways, because they weren't subject to detection by the radar aircraft. And once that was closed with longer range, I think they actually built specific aircraft just for this. But once they were able to figure that out, that gap was closed. In combination with all the other things I mentioned, things got pretty dire for the Kriegsmarine. And the documentary does point this out. In all fairness, it cites a pretty stark statistic, by the way, for the Merchant Marine, who were facing probably a 30% casualty rate or death rate for their operations on the Atlantic. But those poor U-boat sailors.
Yeah, they took 70%, 70 or 80% casualties, yeah.
Horrendous. They called them iron coffins, those U-boats. And it was arguable that the Germans had to do that, obviously to thwart the British. But given the men and material and just the sheer death rates, they were asking a lot from those guys. So I'll leave it up to others to decide the morality of that. But it was a heroic attempt for sure.
No, it's incredible. When I visit, we've got U-505 here in Chicago at the Science and Industry Museum, which is it's a fascinating story around that boat, and you can tour it. And I when people come to visit me, that's often like one of the places I take them because they find it fascinating, and the conditions these guys lived in were just unbelievable, and yeah, just incredibly hard men. The film Das Boot, the Wolfgang Petersen film with Jürgen Prochnow, is just great. I highly recommend it.
It's an absolute masterpiece. And if I may, I would recommend if people to watch it in the original 4-hour-long German television version. And, yeah.
Absolutely. But it you get a sense of what these guys went through and just like how hard they were, just unbelievably, and they were a breed unto themselves. The submariners, they were totally different than the surface fleet. And they were all kind of half crazy, just real warriors, man.
I'd like to add, I think we'll be talking in a later episode about the American intervention into the conflict. But while we're talking about the the boats, as well as the material support from the America to England, I should add here that at the time, basically they had orders. The American ships had orders to attack U-boats that were, when they were providing naval escort to the convoys transporting these materials, they had orders to attack anything that was within 200 to 300 miles from the convoy. And of course, on the other side, Hitler had ordered specifically not to engage with the Americans. And it's quite clear that the purpose of this is that they wanted Germans to shoot at American ships.
No, the December 11th, 1941 declaration that all German flag vessels will be fired upon, that was a declaration of war in all but name, you know. And there's a great book called Hitler versus Roosevelt. It's from the 70s. It's somewhat obscure, and it shouldn't be among students of the war and specifically of the German Reich. There's two aspects to it. You know, first of all, there's the subjects that Hitler viewed Roosevelt in some ways as his primary adversary, and I agree with that. I've written on this rather extensively. But also, yeah, the degree to which, again, like the December 11th, 1941 naval warfare order by, the Roosevelt administration, that was a declaration of war. That is an act of war. You know, so this idea of, the whole issue of the Rainbow 5 leak, which was a deliberate leak, and, how that impacted the psychological environment. We'll have to discuss that in a later episode too. But this idea that, the Germans just spontaneously declared war on the United States for no reason at all, as part of the stupid on purpose narrative that it's a laughable postulate for all kinds of reasons. But the most kind of naked rebuttal to that, is what you just said. The December 11th, 41, or the September 11th, 41, shoot on sight order.
I actually have, if I may, the Hitler on Roosevelt, what he had to say was interesting. It's worth reading. I'll be brief. This is Hitler. Roosevelt comes from a super rich family, belonging from the start to that class of people whose birth and background paved the way to advancement in a democracy. I myself was the child of a small and poor family and had to struggle through life through toilsome work and by personal industry. When the war came, Roosevelt found a spot in the shade under Wilson and experienced the war from the sphere of those who reap dividends from it. He therefore knew only the pleasant consequences of the clash of nations and states, those that provide opportunity for one to do business while another bleeds. I wasn't one of those who made history or did business, but one who simply carried out orders. As an ordinary soldier, I tried to do my duty in the face of an enemy during these 4 years and naturally returned home from the war as impoverished as I had entered it in the fall of 1914. I shared the fate of millions. Mr. Franklin Roosevelt shared it with the so-called upper 10,000. While Mr. Roosevelt, after the war, was already trying his hand at financial speculation, I, together with hundreds of thousands of others, was still lying in a hospital.
Yeah, that says it all.
I don't know if you guys want to dig into some of the vehicles and the technologies. I can speak to that, but where did you guys want to take the discussion? I mean, the documentary, I think the meat of it is really the air war and the Battle of the Atlantic. What else should we talk about?
I don't want to. No, let's get into some specifics. Especially because you prepared some notes in that regard. I don't want to spend. I've got a lot to say on a few subjects that are either tangential or related to the strategic environment subsequent to the Battle of Britain, and I don't want to spin off on that yet. And we're coming up on close to an hour anyway, so yeah, let's let's just focus on some data points for the next like 10, 15 minutes. Then, we'll reconvene next episode with the meat of some of these other, topical emphases.
Sure. Just as a kind of a gearhead, I naturally gravitate towards these types of things, but I hesitate to get too sucked into them because, frankly, war is about logistics, if nothing else. If we're going to pick one thing, and I think it was the famous Napoleon quote, and so that's, I think, where the focus should be ultimately in analyzing strategy. But just for fun, a couple of notes that I took out of all this. So let's go back a little bit to the air war between the Royal Air Force and the Luftwaffe. As an American, we've all been sort of immersed in the sort of hallowed stories of the brave airmen from the British, and there's their famous Spitfire aircraft, and I forget the other one, but it was they were both very, very good fighter aircraft. And then on the German side, the Messerschmitt 109, which was their piston-driven aircraft that was effectively a comparable one. What I took note of was a couple of things. One, I think it was the Thunderbolt, the British equivalent, but most of the British aircraft were carbureted. And so if anybody's ever worked on a motorcycle or a car, the older ones, they have carburetors, and they're basically these little bowls that have fuel in them. And then if you blow some air over it, it aerosolizes it and then goes into the combustion chamber. And that's how you get the boom in the engine, and you turn the crankshaft and you turn the wheels. In an air engine, in an airplane's engine, it's not that dissimilar. The problem is those aircraft have to do some maneuvers that are a little bit different than what a motorcycle or a car has to do.
These were Rolls-Royce engines for the most part too, weren't they?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of the other ones. I mean, these days, it's Pratt and Whitney, General Electric, and Rolls-Royce, but I'm fairly sure Rolls-Royce was the majority of what they were making.
Yeah.
But the weakness of a carbureted engine in the air for a fighter aircraft in particular is that if that thing has to do a roll or a spin or some kind of attack maneuver that puts strain on the airframe and puts some hard G's on the pilot, the fact that it's carbureted causes stalling issues because the fuel supply is constrained by the balance of where that bowl is sitting. And so in other words, if the thing is upside down, the bowl is basically going to spill into the intake of where that aerosol is supposed to go. And so effectively you're choking the engine literally with fuel, 100% fuel, and it's supposed to be a mix of air and fuel. And so what the Messerschmitts had, and they had some disadvantages too, but one of the good things about the ME 109 was that it was fuel injected. And so fuel injection doesn't have that problem where if you spin around, the fuel injectors effectively have the ability to manifest that stream of aerosolized fuel regardless of the orientation of the aircraft. So they had a dogfighting advantage in that. However, the disadvantage was that they underspent on the undercarriage. And so when they would come in for a landing, I think 5% of the casualties or deaths, at least from the losses from the ME 109 was on landing. So those things would break apart. So it's very interesting to see the technical differences. The Irving book also gets into this with the Luftwaffe. The British, and this is later in the war, it wasn't necessarily over Britain, but once, both sides, frankly, were reaching some limits on their resources, in particular in aluminum. So when you make an airplane today, even though carbon fiber has taken on a larger role, that did not exist back then. And so the primary material that was the choke point for making aircraft was aluminum, because it's a lightweight, high strength to weight ratio metal that is strong enough to hold up something like an airplane, but not heavy enough like steel to burn up all your fuel when you try to take off, or even let you take off. So aluminum was big, but the Irving book talks about how the British figured out a way to make a lot of their mosquito bombers out of wood. which was pretty clever because aluminum was one of those things that you kind of need to make it on site. It's really heavy, and it's for whatever reason they actually did not get much of that imported, so they were able to produce most of it or get a lot of it from Canada. But I looked into statistics, and their primary imports for like these critical materials were petroleum, food, weapons. It wasn't aluminum. So the British were facing these constraints, but the Germans, because of bureaucratic and weird technical decisions made at the Messerschmitt and other factories, they couldn't figure out a way to make these aircraft. But later in the war, it was basically their entire bomber fleet was canceled because they were under such an assault from the Allies, primarily the Americans and the British, not so much by air from the USSR, which was sending most of its attack on the ground. But the Germans had to allocate pretty much all their efforts into fighter production. And that's how you get the ME 262, I think, or what is the jet fighter? That's the first,
262. And it's also, that's where you got people like, Ernst Udet, who was a tragic guy, but he really was the wrong man for the job. And Goering, personal loyalty kind of trumped meritocratic evaluation in a lot of his decision making. After Udet committed suicide, it was clear that he'd been grossly mismanaging these decisions in terms of relative allocation to the bomber fleet versus the fighter fleet, as well as a slew of other things. And the mismanagement of Jashonek, who also committed suicide for very different reasons. Jashonek was just a crummy guy in all kinds of ways, but had Milch been at the helm from jump, I think the Luftwaffe's fortunes would have been very different. But guys like Hajo Herman, challenging, attacking Allied aircraft immediately over the target area, rather than sticking to formation. That's one of the reasons why the Germans were able to rack up so many kills. Like the Schweinfurt raid was the darkest day of the U.S. Air Force. They just got massacred, and that owes to the heroism of people like Hajo Herman, as well as the kind of progressive tactical disposition amidst a genuine mortal crisis. Of Milch.
I wanted to get your take, Thomas, on your opinion of Hermann Goering in general, but also in particular as his role with regard to the Luftwaffe. I was confused, and I think I figured it out, but maybe you can clarify as well. His title was Reichsmarschall, and Milch was Feldmarschall, so effectively he was subordinate to Goering. Is that correct?
Yeah, and he was, and Goering was Goering had a number of cabinet posts. He was he'd been the police chief of Berlin. He like one of the early kind of domestic political intelligence agencies, the Forschungsamt. He was the honcho of that. He was an Altkampfer. But yeah, his official title was Reichsmarschall. So he was in our system, he'd be the equivalent of the Air Force Joint Chiefs of Staff. Okay,
sure.
But Milch was not only the founder and the chief executive of Lufthansa, but the Battle of Narvik is when he received his Feldmarschall baton, but he was the number 2 man in the Luftwaffe, and for all practical purposes, especially as Goering became increasingly compromised, Milch became the de facto, commander in chief of the Luftwaffe. Milch is just a great man and a brilliant guy. But Goering was a great man in his own right, and he was a hero. And whatever his problems, he acquitted himself at Nuremberg for all time. And I like the anecdote. He and Milch had been estranged for years. And after Goering's testimony kicked off, Milch would salute him as he passed him, in the detention cells. And I mean, he'd be punished for doing that, obviously, but Goering was a hero and a great man, whatever his vices and his, Goering kind of leaned into being a figure of fun, that his kind of bombastic personality was somewhat curated, and, he was he was a real man of the people, I mean, and he was a genuine aristocrat, he'd grown up in a castle. I think he's a fascinating figure, and I've got a more generous view of him than some people probably, but no, he was a great man for all of his flaws.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to get at with your take. I don't know how much the stuff I'm hearing is propaganda versus fact, and so the British like to make fun of the guy because he was clearly overweight by the end of the war, and he was accused of stealing millions of dollars worth of artwork, and yes, living in a castle. And if he ostensibly is in charge of the Luftwaffe and he's making these bold predictions about how, the air war is all that matters and we'll take Britain, by summertime, and that doesn't happen. I mean, there is something to be said for the fact that he was maybe not paying as much attention to this as he could have. And I want to give, and again, this could be propaganda, but I want to give some credit to his British counterpart, Hugh Dowding, I believe, who was instrumental in organizing the command and control system around the radar and information system that allowed the RAF to organize their defense. I give them a lot of credit for that. I mean, the results sort of speak for themselves. The Germans, again, had sort of a strategic disadvantage because of their resource limitations and their range. So I don't know how much of that is attributable to somebody like Goering. But the accusations have been made that he basically was goofing off. So I don't know.
I mean, there's something to that. But this, yeah, and I mean, Goering liked to he liked to live large. He was, he liked jewelry and expensive clothes. He leaned into, he leaned into this kind of persona, like I said, but. He acquitted himself for all time at Nuremberg, and he beat the hangman. I mean, he was a hero, and as a young man, obviously he took over Richthofen's squadron after Manfred von Richthofen was KIA. He was a war hero. He was injured at the Munich putsch horribly, and that was the source of his morphine addiction because he was maimed. He was shot repeatedly, including he was shot in the balls. I mean, not to be funny or crude. That's what happened. It's a horrible injury. But this idea that he was pilfering the artwork of Europe, thank God the Germans were, quote, stealing this artwork, because otherwise it would have been incinerated by British and American bombs. Does anybody think about that? Apparently not. America and Britain were busily annihilating our cultural heritage.
Mm-hmm. Or looted by the Red Army, which it was.
Yeah. It. But yeah, we're. Let's wrap for now, man. And like I said, there's some topics I want to deep dive into, but if I did so now, we'd be here all night. I don't want to be abrupt, but I'm still not feeling great. Okay. But yeah.
Well, the next episode is the Eastern Front, and that's
exactly.
going to be a huge one. So
yeah, and I'll be able to devote a couple hours, if you guys want to that subject matter. But no, this was great, man.
Awesome. Okay.
Any closing thoughts? I'll edit this, but we can cut it prior to that. But any closing thoughts on the significance of the British v. the Germans, especially in 1940?
I mean, I just say it. The patent irrationality of it is, it's just positive of the overall orientation of the war party. And I think setting the record straight is essential. I mean, there's a few aspects of the war that really stand out as in need of correction. To in order to, kind of rectify the big lie that, is the court history view of the Second World War. But it's always kind of stuck in my craw, this idea again that the Germans terror bombed the United Kingdom without provocation, because the entire thing, like Nick said, it's pretty much everything the British accuse others of doing is massive projection. It's really, it's like satire. But yeah, other than that, no, I don't have anything else to add.
Well, there are two twin cities between the British and Germans that I think have formed a friendship pact in our modern era, and that is of Coventry and Dresden, and both were victims, the civilian population at least, of assaults. And there are I've actually been in the Frauenkirche in Dresden, which they had to rebuild after the British destroyed it. And it was left like that, I think, during the Cold War. And after German reunification, they put it back together. And there is a cross that was given to them by the British from Coventry. And I thought that was an interesting symbol because those were two sites of a tremendous loss of life on both sides. And I don't think we should downplay the loss of life of these two peoples, regardless of our particular preferences. The reality is these wars were unnecessary and wasteful for everyone in the West, and it's easy to forget that what happened was really not up to most of those people that were doing those things. It was decisions made on high. And I think it's a lesson to all of us that, we need to have good leaders, and leaders that are good can take us in good places. But, things like this happen, unfortunately. And, we'll get into it more in the Eastern Front, which is even worse.
On May the 10th, 1941, London suffered its most destructive night raid of the war. Over 3,000 people were killed or injured. Hundreds of fires had to be left to burn themselves out. There seemed no end in sight to the slaughter and destruction. But although Londoners didn't know, it was the turning point.
In April 41, Hitler assembled all the commanders in France, and during 2 hours, he talked to us about the part 2 of the Battle of Britain. He told us later, 2 of us, namely Mölders, my friend Mölders, and myself, that it has only been in order to camouflage the offensive against Russia. This has been in April 41. And the raid on the 10th of May can only be considered as a camouflage of the beginning Russian campaign.
Among the casualties of the raid on May the 10th was the House of Commons. For exactly a year of disappointment and defeat, the Commons had sustained Churchill in office. But the important battle had been won. Britain had survived. Now it was Russia's turn.